Hello everybody, Brian Salter, and I'm back here. I was wanting to give you the cause and effect of what happened to the story, what happened to that engine that was smoking only at idle. Had some interesting comments or questions, I should say, so I want to get to those. First question was, why didn't they immediately know it was the rear brake caliper? I don't know. I wasn't driving the car. I was, remember, I'm got multiple engines at this event, and I'm just trying to get everybody, make sure everybody's good. And I'm getting this feedback from the driver, my engine's flat, I explained that in my first video, what he meant by that. Also, you also have to remember that this was during the heat of the day. And when you come in off a track like that, all the brakes are super hot. So you wouldn't see a glowing rotor because it wasn't dark yet. Now, not to say they couldn't have took a heat gun and went around. Again, I don't know. But I'll tell you how we found it. We found it was after I got, I told you I got really angry with the guy, and I went over there. They put the car up on jack stands, and I went around, started with just rolling wheels and felt the rolling resistance. And when I got to the rear end, there it was. It was difficult to roll. I could roll it, but it was difficult to roll with my hands. And I said, something is wrong. I didn't know if it was the axles, the bearings, the ring and pinion. I didn't know what it was. So they came and told me, we found it. It's the caliper. I don't know if it was the hose, the brake hose had gone bad. I just wasn't sure. But that's what they told me caused it. And obviously that did fix it. Whatever they did to the rear brakes, that did fix it. And I had a question of, I could have done a compression test and found it. And let me tell you why that wouldn't work. So we're talking about a race engine. Now, all 8 cylinders were doing the exact same thing, okay? And we're talking about an engine that was under high vacuum. So, and that made it actually, I think, more difficult to find. When you do a compression test on an engine like that, you might get 220 cranking compression. You might get more, you might get a little less. The reason I say you might get more or less is because the camshaft dictates the cranking compression on this thing. When you're statically, you've built the engine to the rule book, which is 12.1 to 1. That was the rules. So depending on your cam grind, where it was dialed in, how much overlap you have, the valve clearance at the time, you can change cylinder pressure with all that adjustment. So if you had, just for example, if I got 220 plus or minus a pound or two on all 8 cylinders, what does that tell me? Well, it doesn't help me find this problem. So I'm going to show you what happened, and I'm going to show you why it was so difficult to find. So stay tuned. If you remember in the story, I rebuilt this engine multiple times, like I think 3. And again, this was about 12, 13 years ago. This is what happened. This is why it was so hard to find in the end. So what happened is the piston company, and no, it was not JE, because I had somebody ask me, I really like JE. You can get a bad component from anybody, wasn't JE, but anyway, the piston company, this area right here, this is called the piston ring back cut. It's put in your piston. This area right here was the problem. It was cut too far. And it was cut too far. When I say that, that sounds like it might have been easy to spot, but it wasn't. It wasn't cut so far that you could stick your ring in the piston and say, oh, that's way too deep. I either got the wrong ring or this piston is made incorrectly. No, it was cut too far just enough, because what happened is, again, when you start the engine, it ran fine. It took about 10 minutes and then it would start smoking. And then as soon as you got on the throttle, the cylinder pressure increased and the smoking stopped. You'd run a 2-hour race, come in out off the track, and it would literally have to idle another few minutes before you would start to see any sign of smoke again. So that's why it was so difficult to find. The up and down portion of the ring groove was made correctly. It was the depth that was wrong. And it was only wrong by, 10 thousandths or so. I sent the piston back to the company, and the engineer called me and says, we found the problem. And I sent it back out of frustration. Again, I explained what all I went through. So I was running, it was a while back. I think I was running a 32,000 stick ring. Okay, that's pretty thin, but I run that a lot of times. We've not had any issues with it, but it was just this one set of pistons, guys, one set. So it was very difficult to find. It was right there was the issue. Now, let me say, do yourself a favor. If you don't do this, make sure you start looking at everything, even that. So I have checked these things in the past, and I checked it on this motor, but I did not see it. And, I learned a valuable lesson that day. So what can I say? Hey, lesson learned. But I promise you, it was not obvious. It was not obvious even the slightest bit. And I'm going to show you a cutaway I did so that you can kind of have a little more understanding of what we're looking for. All right, so as you can see, I've just ground this back a little bit so you can see what's happening here. The ring depth as it sits in the ring land is what I'm talking about, okay? Now this is obviously not the piston we used. Look right there where the ring, as it sits all the way inside the ring back cut. You'll notice there is about 10 thousandths between the ring and the outside of the piston, okay? It's sitting in there, and it's sitting below the outside of the diameter of the piston. It's sitting down in there about 10 thousandths. And the piston that was cut wrong was just a little further than that, and it was just enough to give me that smoke only at idle. Now, in the video, I said we had this thing cranked up on vacuum, and let me explain how that was done, because it's important that you understand how and why we did things. So we increased the vacuum to the oil pan. We had Barnes oil pumps, 5-stage oil pumps, and what we did was the main oil line going into the block, we put a ball valve on that main oil line, and we cut the oil flow back, okay? And by cutting the oil flow back means that the scavenging hoses in the lifter valley and in the oil pan will suck more air than they do oil. And that's how you're able to pull the engine way down in the vacuum. So it can be done, very easily done. That's not something you would do while the engine is racing or even making a hard dyno pull. It's just something we were trying to see if we increased the vacuum, would it help stop the smoke? And obviously it did not. It did not help it. So let me explain this too. So one last thing that increased the difficulty. Now, what I've done here is, this is the ring in the ring land piston here, and all I'm trying to show you is this will be my combustion chamber and a valve and the exhaust pipe, and of course the intake would be going off in this direction. What I want to show you is, remember, this engine is under very high vacuum, okay? So what happens is, and we're just gonna illustrate, what happens is your exhaust valve and intake valves, they can be open a little bit, and that vacuum on your pan will start pulling vacuum by any open valve through the header, through the intake, and that vacuum, as the pan is pulling on it, will suck the oil back right back off the rings again. So as it sits there and cools down, the vacuum would leak by the rings, pulling the oil back out of the rings as it sat there, and therefore every time you cranked it, it took another 10 minutes or so to start smoking again. So if it sat any length of time, it wouldn't smoke when you first started it. It took 5 to 10 minutes of idling, and then it would start smoking. And that pan vacuum is why that happened. So again, that's why I say I think the pan vacuum made it a little harder to diagnose. I'm telling you guys, this was a tricky one, very tricky. So I hope that you're able to take this and never let it happen to you. Check everything. I mean, you just can't trust, you know, everything you get. So I hope that explains what happened and why it happened. And yeah, thank you for your comments. I do appreciate them. Please like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications. And we'll see you next time.